What you've got here is you've got a user, you've got a hyperscaler, and you've got a data center. So I've got three broad minds on the topic of how much compute that we will need. And I'm going to start, though, on the question of AI readiness. And Rahul, I'm going to start with you because it's well known in the press that you've got a very enthused leadership about the concept and potential of AI. They've gone on a study tour to Seattle, and I wonder who they would have seen in Seattle to talk about the potential of AI in organizations. They've come back, they've mandated, I think, some people to actually come up with test pilots for AI. So you've got all this enormous enthusiasm. Are you ready for it?
Great question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Look, so I like to comment on how to think about it. So, of course, NAB believes it's ready for it and thinking about it in a very measured way. But if you think about what underpins AI, I really like Jason's conversation right before. It's really having that cloud infrastructure engineering muscle across the organization that you can build upon. And the way we think about it is really, we have that engineering and cloud infrastructure by and large understood well within our bank. But then can we articulate, can we understand the various different use cases that the business can drive value, right? Can we actually unpack those use cases for efficiencies across our bank? Can we talk about the ROI it generates before we really go into building those use cases at scale? And then lastly, really understanding the security implications. If this weekend was a testament for all of us, understanding the operational risk of any use case that you take to scale. And getting security right, getting the architecture right, getting those return on investments realized. I think that's what you have to start thinking through to actually say, I am AI ready.
But I'm just thinking of an executive who's keen to drive the organization forward, and you're talking about all these sort of things like compliance and risks. Have we got all things correct? Are you seen as a negative force against that energy and enthusiasm?
No, not at all. I think it's being more measured. It's working with the business that understand our customers. It's working with our colleagues. We understand the use cases for AI, and in general, the hype recently, generative AI in the last 2 years, and understanding that first and just going after targeted use cases. So the enthusiasm is great, but balancing that with what we can actually deliver and deliver well, and well understood business cases are highly important.
Okay, well, Sarah, you came to me and said, it's all about, you got to think, the challenge we have that people are wrestling about being AI ready is building the sort of ROI to actually assessing what are we going to get out of it. And I'm wondering whether that is being, again, a sort of negative force, because in some ways, haven't we got to be experimenting? We've got to be trying. We've got to be seeing how we go with the technology. If we stop and think, how do all the numbers run out, we'll be surpassed by others.
Yes, but we're all businesses at the end of the day, right? So we all have to make money. So return on investment is absolutely critical. And so most organizations I see stepping into this space are looking at it in two ways. They're setting aside some money to experiment. So maybe there are some use cases that are more edge cases that they're not certain of, but they want to test anyway. But the rest of them they are working through, exactly as Rahul's saying, is picking those use cases really carefully, thinking about where the barriers are to implementing those, and then where you're going to get the greatest return on that investment. And then actually looking at how and where you're going to measure that return. I liked the previous speaker was talking about it as well. Like ROI should be the number one thing you're thinking about when you're looking at deploying any of these things. Like, how do you make sure you've thought about this holistically end to end? Where do we measure? When do we measure? How are we going to measure it? And how do we iterate over time? Because of course, AI doesn't stand still. It changes over time. So the way you measured it today won't be the same as the way you measure it tomorrow. So yes, ROI. I'd love to build on what Rahul was saying as well, because the strategy and the data piece, you're saying it's the negative Nelly. Data governance is sexy again. Go do data governance. Yeah. Because if you haven't got that in place, if you haven't thought about your strategy, all of this falls down. You can't actually achieve any of those use cases or return on investment if you haven't actually got that governance piece in place. And we see boards being really forward and positive about it, looking at the risk and assessing it effectively and making sure they've got frameworks that enable them to actually harness all that exciting use case that comes through from the business.
Great, what about yourselves? You've got to have all the sort of compute power to support that. What I'm hearing from Sarah and Rahul is just sort of learning and pushing, developing and thinking of the cases where it would go. But as soon as they go to you, you've got to be equipped and powered up and ready to support it regardless. So how do you, in a commercial sense, anticipate the needs and build for them in advance without overcommitting?
Well, I'm very fortunate they're both customers, so I get the benefit of working closely with both organisations. We're coming at it from different places. If you look at Rahul's organisation as a leader in the banking industry, the bank has been quite publicly an early adopter of cloud technology and done some extraordinary things under Patrick Wright and Rahul's leadership to really move the bank into that highly agile environment where it can take advantage of large-scale cloud infrastructure. But it doesn't mean that legacy infrastructure doesn't exist. So the days of operating on-premise legacy data centers are certainly behind us. Availability, cloud networking, sustainability. Nobody wants to be running an old power-hungry on-premise data center. So moving both your legacy compute into a highly efficient facility where you get benefits of good power utilization and sustainability outcomes, but you also get the benefit of being able to work closely with Microsoft and Amazon and other key cloud providers, provides the business with a high degree of flexibility. From a planning point of view, really from our standpoint on the commercial side, everything we've been through over the last decade, and that's up to hundreds of megawatts worth of compute support, is about to change. So as we think about the shift from general purpose computing into accelerated computing, it's an entirely new infrastructure era, and that will give rise and is already giving rise to somewhere in the order of 3 to 5 times more capital and more infrastructure required in the next few years than we've seen in the entire previous decade.
So what I'm hearing you say, in some ways, that debate of what to build is actually the capital is coming for it. They can see the future. You're not having to sort of weigh up the commercial reality of that. You can actually have the confidence to go forward and build the data centers that Australia's going to need.
Yeah, we've always taken the approach that the customers forecast in terms of whether it's public or private cloud or legacy compute, as those on-premise data centers would be retired, we were building the infrastructure and ultimately over time they would come. The key thing that's changing is the scale and the rate at which compute density is changing, and so too do customers' demands from a scalability or a sustainability point of view. And if you combine those with the number of as-a-service providers, the ecosystem that is required to provide services to an enterprise like Rahul's is not just a small handful of providers, it's hundreds of specialist services.
Okay. Rahul, you were talking in terms of AI readiness, to think about this in terms of a productivity lens when we're talking about the business cases that we're building. And you sort of see that actually becomes the foundations, that once you start thinking in terms of productivity, it gets you into areas like compliance, privacy. That sort of flushes out all the associated things that help build the business case. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So let's think about a little bit about generative AI. Specifically, what it does today, it's generating either audio, video, or actual text. That's really high value. And if you think about some of the use cases in our everyday lives, both on the consumer side and the enterprise side, there are just a number of use cases. You take Copilot to generate email, you talk about software development, you talk about just being able to go into a meeting and have a transcript summarized to you. That is all making your life much, much easier to get to what's important for you to work on. And it's really about being productive with AI. So I think that those use cases rise to the top in general. Now, I believe there is a lot more potential in AI. And as we go the next year, 2 years, 3 years, there'll be a lot more use cases coming out of it. And the models will get better and better and better. But if an enterprise isn't thinking about how do we make our colleagues productive, how do we get to what's at the core of our customers faster and just drive that value, I think that's where AI needs to be grounded on, versus there are some use cases perhaps are not very clearly articulated. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. Sarah, you were talking to me about the hype cycle. You know, where are we with AI in the hype cycle? And your phrase to me is, we're just tilting over the edge, about to plummet into this trough of disillusionment. Do you think that we should see AI like every other new technology that we've had, that we will get that trough of disillusionment?
We will, and a lot of it is what Rahul's actually talking about there, is these use cases, if you're not fully realising them or they're not thought through, people start using it, they don't realise the benefits they were expecting and they stop using it. You see it drop off really quickly. And so we've had lots of hype, let's be honest, every day. I feel like there's another thing about AI that comes out. And we're sitting right on that cusp, but there are lots of things you can do to stop that becoming a plummet down into the trough of disillusionment, and that's what we were talking about. Thank you for the context. And so what we were talking about is the fact that you can bend that curve. What is little known is the bottom of the curve is to do with the education, the capabilities within your organisation, regulation and governance, and so you can bend a whole load of those things within your organisation. Better skills and training, better understanding. Regulation, things like responsible AI frameworks within your organisation actually prevent that deep dip into the trough of disillusionment and help you move across into realising those benefits that Rahul was alluding to. But I wanted to touch on what Rahul said, because I love how our language has changed so fast. So when people respond to meetings that they can't attend now in Microsoft, we say, don't worry, I'll co-pilot it. So we know that we're going to watch the video or catch up and use Copilot to summarize it. It's like the best meeting is one I don't attend any longer. And so it's really interesting. But the thing that I see most organizations challenged by is, how do you measure that productivity? Like lots of customers I have rolled out things like Copilot, but they didn't think about how they're going to measure productivity gains. And they've now said to their employees, well, if we take this off you, will you still work for us? And they're like, no. So like, great, we have no way of measuring if it's actually doing what we expected, but we can't take it back off you. And so I think it's really important to think about how you're going to measure productivity. It's such a nebulous concept. And so we look at 3 lenses. I love 3s. We think about, are we creating more things? Are we comprehending things faster? And are we collaborating more? Those are the 3 C's we look at when we think about productivity measurement. But creation isn't always the perfect thing, because I could create lots of rubbish with the system. So how do you know you're creating quality? It's a really tough one to think about, that productivity, and where are you going to see those benefits of it?
Well, and I just came from a round table where part of the discussion was, do we become so dependent on the technology that we lose the mental capability to come up with the innovation and the ideas and the creativity, that sort of stuff.
Which, I don't know why I'm bringing it up. The disaster over the weekend. Like, imagine if we were so reliant on AI that we had this lazy thinking. Like that's what we're risking in doing this, is if you put these in every place, in every system, you risk lazy thinking, that people don't know how to do the things manually anymore. So you think about all those airlines who had to manually write out airline tickets. What if we lose those skills because we've made all these things automated? So I can't believe Microsoft's telling you don't put AI everywhere, but don't put AI everywhere. Think about where, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Like, think about where it belongs and where it plays a really positive role.
And the balance of it, don't sort of be totally dependent on something, pull something back.
Yeah.
Craig, in terms of your own organization with the data center, where do you be AI ready in terms of your own operations? How would you see AI can make NextDC a more effective organization?
I was just going to start with Sarah. You should definitely put AI everywhere. But as a user, and I've been fortunate, I've been involved in machine learning for over a decade with La Trobe University School of Cognitive Analytics, and it's an area that I continue to study over time. So very early on, when we were thinking about preventative maintenance with generators and chillers and other core infrastructure, we were using microphones and recording devices to take the frequency of different plant and infrastructure and then record that over time and look for variations in the frequencies that would allow us to then analyse which plant was starting to get out of phase and what would need preventative maintenance. And I think there's a lot of examples over time where we've been taking that machine learning data and then trying to apply it to a problem in our business. But if you think back to November 22, when we first saw what ChatGPT was capable of, you realise that the universe of information that we've been collecting could now really be made sense of. We had the ability to be able to start to ingest not only text, but we could ingest audio and video data. And when you can start to take all those multimodal forms of information, it wasn't that long ago that only 0.5% of the world's information was actually made sense of, and we were recording all this information but weren't actually doing anything useful with it. So when I think about my chief information officer and his role and responsibility is not only to be responsible for providing the business with all of the tools that it needs to be successful, but also working out how we can learn more about the organisation from the information that we have. But the preventative maintenance example was one very specific case study where we'd had the data, but now we're able to take very specific actions as a result of collecting it.
Well, I think that would be an area, Craig, that would be of interest to a lot of people here who might be involved with the infrastructure management of their own organization in the cloud. So some insights into what that sort of preventative maintenance, how you've been able to be more effective by sort of be forewarned about potential issues would be, if you've got any thoughts there you can share.
Yeah, well, ultimately, as a critical infrastructure provider, you want to ensure that you can intervene before a failure actually takes place. And despite the resiliency of cloud services, you still see outages on a global scale. And they happen because organizations will still have single points of failure. The single point of failure could be the network, the single point of failure could be in the data center, the single point of failure could be in the application or the update. So until you've been through every element from infrastructure through to the application and the user and the network to connect to the user, these are not unique experiences. You think about the telecommunications outages that we had recently, where we have experienced core critical infrastructure that you would just expect to be resilient is not resilient. So as you find those examples, it's through failures that reminds most users that they have to run business continuity and disaster recovery tests. They have to be prepared for these type of things. It's not until you go through a situation that causes some sort of interruption to service that directly impacts a user that the organisation goes back and says, well, what is our service level agreement and how do we ensure that our infrastructure is resilient? So we've found a lot of those examples in our business. What it ultimately allows us to do is to manage the level of resiliency that we would apply. In some cases, you can have fewer systems because you have preventative warning mechanisms in place to ensure that infrastructure won't fail.
Okay. I have forewarned the panelists that my final question to them will be about last Friday and maybe what their learnings and lessons were from, but let's wait till we get there because the next part of the question is how much compute do we need? And Sarah, you said something quite provocative to me. You wondered whether we were tilting at windmills when we're thinking about how much compute we really need. And in your view forward, you think AI models will get smaller and more nimble. And I was interested in that because everyone else is talking to me about we're going to need this massive amount of computing to support this.
Oh, Craig and I were having this conversation just before we came on stage. And I said, how much compute do we need? He's like, a lot. So there you go. There's the answer. We need a lot. And it's really hard. It's like gazing into my crystal ball and making a wild guess because at the same time as we are expanding data centers at a rate that I have never seen. The number that are opening every month, every week, every day around the world, the scale is phenomenal. We have a stat at Microsoft at the moment. We've hired 100,000 electricians because we have so many data centers. We need a city's worth of electricians to build and maintain these things. But at the same time, models are getting smaller. You know, the latest models, Phi 3 from Microsoft, can run on your mobile phone. And so we've got these two things, this dualism happening. We have these large language models and we have small language models that are emerging. And so which one is going to take precedence? Which one will people focus on more? There is this focus, particularly in Australia, around sovereign capability. And so small language models is probably the path that Australian government will want to go down, because they can do it locally, they can manage it themselves, they can train it effectively. So how much compute do we need? It's such a tough question.
Well, and you said to me when we were preparing for this, you know, are we asking the right question? Let's determine how we should be using it, AI first, and the training for it. Can you elaborate on that sort of angle that you think we should be focusing on?
As in use cases that we
I think your words to me were, Sarah, bear with me on this because I've got them written down here.
Oh.
I said, I don't think how much compute we need is the issue people are struggling with. What they're grappling with is how you deploy AI, what are the models for it, and where do you deploy it?
Yeah, I think because it's become so complex. Like, how do you choose which of the many models that are out there you're going to use? Which one do you need? How do you tell the difference between them? Are there differences between them? There are. There are definite differences between the models. But for most people, how do you know that? How do you work out which one you need to use? And I think that's creating some inertia. I'd be really interested in Rahul's opinion on that, which is trying to work out how you move forward with the use case and what you actually need to deploy and where it gets deployed, and is it deployed locally, or do you use international models, and does it matter to you as an organization as well, is a really big question, again, because we come back to that question of sovereignty. And we just saw what happened over the last few days of outages elsewhere in the world and the flow-on impact into Australia. So I know the other one you have on your paper is we discussed a trend I am seeing towards on-premises. There seems to be this concept that AI needs to be done on premises, and I don't know where that came from. Please help me.
But I wonder with Craig might. I'll give you the right
to
reply here, Craig.
But it's fascinating to me that this is a conversation topic that's come up. Like, didn't we just move away from that? Didn't we just work out that the way you can be agile and you get the compute you want for the lowest cost is to be in the cloud? And now we're talking about moving everything back on premises.
Everything old is new again.
I know.
But
anyway,
but your argument to me was that was the financial models of organization that were driving that decision making.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing. It's one of the big things that is hamstringing organizations. And again, I'd be interested in how you're experiencing this, is CapEx versus OpEx. Yeah. We haven't moved our financial models to enable us to actually do the things we want to do in the cloud or more dynamically and agilely. And that's forcing people to consider this on-premises option as a way of actually leveraging this moment.
Yeah.
That wasn't the view you gave me, though, Rahul. You were sort of talking about actually it's iterative evolution, and the hyperscalers will support you, and your challenge is scale.
Look, I'll comment on how much compute we need, and I'll tie it into the hyperscalers ones here. I think the compute point, there are lots of really, really intelligent engineers on the planet that do performance engineering very well. They'll eventually figure out how to run these models very efficiently because the demand's so high, right? So I do believe as an enterprise, and lots of us might be working for an enterprise or a company, the value for us is really focusing on how do we look at what's in front of us? How do we articulate the value proposition inside the company and go after the actual productivity gains and so forth? But if you think about how much compute do we need, I do agree with Sarah that will, in time, get less and less, but there are tons of models coming out. There are tons of different use cases. There are lots of startups competing. And I can imagine all of the hyperscalers will go after it, go after the opportunity in the market. So I think in the short term, there will be an uptick in compute, but it remains to be seen how well do we become in performance engineering the compute to make it more efficient to run in general. Hit on Sarah's question on how do we think about it. To me, there are two patterns, right? So the two emerging patterns at the moment are thinking about which framework or which large language model to utilize and capitalize on. or go and buy the capability and integrate into your application stack.
Mm.
And again, tying it right back to the business case for it. So those are the two patterns that almost everyone's grappling with. And largely, I think what I see the easier pattern to enable and get faster time to market, faster time to value is the buy pattern, is getting that capability, integrating it and going on with it, and let the folks who are very good at building these models behind the scene drive the functionality for it. Now then comes the compliance and the security and the integration and making sure you get that right in the organization. So you've got to go at it in a very methodical way.
So you're looking to the suppliers to predict what your requirements will be and build models that give you a core that you can then sort of put the associated stuff around it in terms of security and compliance and stuff like that.
Because some of the opportunity is you won't have a buy opportunity. You can just go and if you're looking at it from an internal, hey, you have a real use case. There are some financials on the planet that are building large language models for financial data, right? And they're building in-house engineering for it. And there are some that are just simple use cases. You integrate Copilot. Let's unlock, SharePoint generative AI. Those kinds of use cases are generally sort of back down to the two patterns. Where do you actually build versus where do you buy? And that's where I see most of the folks going after the opportunity.
Well, Rahul, you did say something quite provocative to me when we did the preparatory call, which was theoretically the hyperscalers have unlimited capacity.
Right.
So you don't lose any sleep about the compute you need because they'll serve you as a customer.
Yeah. We all know that's not true, right? At the end of the day, it's not true, but you would want to believe that and you want to capitalize on that. Right. And I think the idea there is to design your applications to be resilient, to be failing over and taking advantage of the different regions. So if you design them correctly, if you design your AI models correctly, if you design your integrations properly, you can capitalize on the unlimited compute and unlimited scale. But I think the hyperscalers are going to go after that before we do as an enterprise. They're going to solve that problem much more efficiently than we will.
But your point to me when we spoke was actually it's about the scale. It's about making the organization, having enough muscle, I think was the term you used, that you can scale pretty straightforwardly after that.
Spot on. I mean, this weekend, I know we're going to get into that at the end, waiting for it. But it's a real wake-up call, right? What happens when you have an AI capability in your organization that is a critical capability and you don't fully understand the operational risk of it?
Yeah.
So what happens then, right? And right now, it's sort of a nice to have. You're focused on productivity, but when it becomes a critical capability and you don't fully understand both the security controls, the operational risk, the business continuity of something going wrong, those are the things that you have to worry about now and get better at it.
Yeah. Craig, you wanted to say something?
No, just look, my view, how much compute do we need? If we go back in time, in 1965, Gordon Moore, who was the co-founder of Intel, wrote a seminal white paper. At the time, he said the number of transistors on an integrated circuit would double every 18 to 24 months. Now, at the time he wrote that, that was the beginning, essentially, of the capabilities that we have, on our phones and our laptops and in the cloud today. He was right for 60 years. So what became known as Moore's Law. And that is the reason we have the technology capability that we have today. In history, every industrial revolution, we have moved forward as a result of advances in electrification. So the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, if you use Ray Kurzweil, the head of artificial intelligence at Google, if you use his description, technology built by technology will drive an exponential rate of change. So Kurzweil's log chart shows that, and his new book has just come out, so a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't read it, Ray Kurzweil, The Singularity is Nearer. So in 2005, he published The Singularity is Near. If you want to look at all of the areas that he believes in the next 20 or 30 years will drive significant change in society across all fields of technology, science, it's a stunning read. But for me, it really puts into context this change from the previous generation. We've been through four generations of computing. We've got mainframe, distributed compute, cloud, and now we're about to go through the era of moving from general purpose computing to accelerated computing. And the how much question is reasonably straightforward for me, because when you look at the change from CPU to GPU, you're talking about a 10x change in power. So I think that it's reasonable to assume, given the current NVIDIA designs for DGX, Blackwell, and other similar infrastructures, that we will see 5 to 10 times more compute available here and globally within the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, Craig, I've now got to stir the hornet's nest, because we're going to talk about your views that the energy transition that we need to support that compute. And you've got some pretty strong views on that.
Well, I do, and we don't have an hour. But needless to say, and I'll make sure I leave plenty of time for the rest of the team, but I'll just make a couple of quick comments. If you consider that the Sydney market's sort of just a touch under 3 gigawatts and the Melbourne market's just a touch over 2 gigawatts, Australia, sort of between the two major cities, is a 5 gigawatt market, is sort of similar size to New York City. Now, the forecast is that we're going to need at least 3 or 4 times that amount of power over the course of the next decade. We're going to retire coal-fired power stations because net zero and sustainability by 2030 is a critical target for everybody. And if you're a public company and you've got to make commitments to those goals, the next question you get asked is how? And it's simple, we'll just have more solar and more wind. But by nature of intermittent energy, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So therefore, we need firming capacity or replacement baseload power for coal. And it really only falls into a handful of categories. We either have gas, geothermal, large-scale battery, gigawatt-scale battery, or hydro. The fifth option, which we can't even have a conversation about in this country, is nuclear. And advanced nuclear, Australia is the only country in the G20 that has a ban on nuclear energy today. So from my perspective, we are sleepwalking into an energy crisis. I believe that energy is probably the most critical factor to ensuring that as a country we can continue to advance over the course of the next decade. We're incapable of realising the fact that renewables will not get there in of themselves. And we don't have a plan to be able to support the retirement of the coal-fired power stations and replace them with sustainable firming baseload energy over time. So it's a critical issue. And
but
frankly,
I hear so many different views, and from even some of your competitors in data centers who give me the opposite perspectives, and they feel quite confident in the solar and wind and battery as a way to go forward. You clearly are not. But
I'm sure they are, and everybody's entitled to their opinion. I still believe that if you can show me a gigawatt scale battery capability that can be delivered in time to replace coal at a reasonable cost, well, we may have a solution. But given the volume of battery metals that will be required for EVs over time, I can't see a sustainable and cost effective. The biggest issue, and this will become an issue that is ultimately decided at the next election, is the cost of energy and energy affordability, something that people are prepared to pay for. If the government focuses on roads, rail, port, infrastructure, education, and jobs, and creates and has the energy infrastructure at a low cost that allows investment in the country because the infrastructure pillars are in place, we let the free market take care of itself. My belief is simply that I don't see that all of the key elements from a government point of view are in place to ensure an orderly transition to a net zero energy economy.
Well, and I think a quote I got from you was that we're building more infrastructure than this country has the power to support.
And that's true. In the industry, if you look at the top 3 or 4 data center providers in this country, and they're all forecasting building between 0.5 gigawatt and more than 1 gigawatt, the top 3 or 4 data center providers will build more data center capacity than the entire Sydney and Melbourne energy market today. I don't know that there's a solution.
Well, let's go. I've got 4 minutes left, and I'm
You
sure
go.
people in the audience will have strong views, but we'll have to ask them to go to Craig after this, because I want to focus on last Friday and what we learned. And Rahul, what did you learn in terms of, as an enterprise architecture at one of the top 4 banks in this country? What lessons came away for you?
I mean, I don't think anyone could have predicted an endpoint protection service is a globally critical problem. Just think about it for a second, right? It's something that you're protecting your endpoints with. It's something that almost every one of us, whether they do it with CrowdStrike or their competitors, are making sure we have that capability well understood in our bank or anywhere else you work. But did we really understand when those updates are happening? Did we really understand what happens when one of those updates go wrong? Did we really understand the operational risk? Did we actually think, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have one vendor doing endpoint security for my entire fleet? And it wasn't just one enterprise. This is a globally relevant problem, right? So now I think because of last weekend, because of what we've learned, we're going to go back and inspect how we were imagining and designing and what are our policies and what's compliance around those kinds of services, right? I mean, there's so much to unpack in what happened on Friday. It's fascinating to me that these things could happen. And I think it's just going to change the dynamic as we go into the next few weeks. The conversations have already started.
As an individual, not a company spokesman, what did you learn from
Yeah.
last?
That's a good way to get around it.
Thank you. That was very kind of Peter. No, it's fascinating, and it was talked about in the previous session a bit here, which is about that understanding and testing of your business continuity, like knowing your ecosystem fully and understanding what those flow-on impacts are. The number of customers I saw who hadn't ever enacted or tested their business continuity and therefore suffered as a result. They didn't know who to go to. They didn't have a call list. They didn't have any of those things in place. So it was just really interesting, and I hope everyone takes that away, which is it's great to have a plan, but it shouldn't be in a drawer and it should be tested regularly. It's really interesting, the conversation that's happening now around multi-vendor ecosystems versus sole vendor ecosystems. And I don't think there is one right answer, because there is complexity in both and there's risk in both. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out, exactly as you said, like as people inspect this and they make a choice, understanding what your organizational capability is. Like multi-cloud is absolutely phenomenal if you can run that and you can carry multiple clouds and capabilities across an organization, but not all organizations can. So how you think about that. But the one thing that really stood out to me, and this is really interesting as an insider, is how collaborative the tech industry actually is. So the world was on fire on Friday afternoon, and no tech org, no partner, no one that we work with said, I'm sorry, it's not my problem. Everyone was calling in and saying, how do I help? And I thought that was really heartening in a tech industry, of how everyone just poured in and tried to find a way of getting particularly Australian businesses back up and running, and across the whole of the weekend. So it was really interesting just seeing that.
The punchline I really liked was, it's Y2K 24 years later.
Yeah.
Craig, I'm going to give the last word with you. What did you take away from last Friday?
I'll just make 2 comments. One, I learned we weren't using CrowdStrike. That was an important lesson. And look, it sort of just reminds me of the whole COVID experience, right? For everyone who ran an IT organization, COVID was the moment where you realized, when you did disaster recovery and business continuity testing, you told one division of your company to go home and work from home. And that 200 people dialed up on the 200 VPN licenses you had. And then you sent another 200 people home, and they dialed up and it worked. But when 2,000 people went home and all tried to dial up at the same time, they couldn't connect. I mean, the testing of business continuity and disaster recovery is probably the single most important factor we have when we rely on third-party organisations for anything in our businesses. And my key takeaway is it just reminded me that the chaos monkey concept of ensuring that you regularly pull a cord and see what happens in the organisation will allow you to test the level of resilience you have in real time.
Okay.
Can I add one more point?
Go on.
I think this is really important for all the enterprises out there. Third-party risk management, right? whether it's SaaS or a service that's embedded in your kernel, in your OS, understanding what those risks are is incredibly important as we go into the next few weeks, and reassessing our stack, reassessing what those capabilities are. It's very different now. It's just, imagining like those are globally important issues, and you have the right third-party risk management frameworks in your organization.